to you for coming along. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about, well, it's billed as best practice. I'm not sure that's what I describe my practice as best. It might be good practice, I'll try that, okay? And one of the things that informs me here is the way in which we teach Scottish literature to international students. The way that we teach Scottish literature, where we assume that students don't know much about Scotland at all, yeah? And it's how do you get a quick handle on perhaps a wee bit of the culture, a bit of the language, that kind of thing. So hopefully it's going to give you quick ways, I hesitate to use the term, but I'm going to use it, hacks, that you can use in the classroom if you're time poor and the students don't have a lot of background knowledge, etc. That's the plan anyway, okay? So I'm going to focus on three poets particularly, who I build here as Scottish national poets. This chap up here, can I do a straw poll? Does anybody recognise this?
Scott!
This one? That's Robert Burns, that's Scotland's national bard. So I'll say more about that. It was just to know how much I should cover and not cover, yeah? This is, so that's Robert Burns, Scotland's national bard. He's not been appointed, ever appointed Scotland's national bard. That's a sort of unofficial title in the same way as Shakespeare is the national bard of England, if you know what I mean. This is Edwin Morgan, so we're coming a bit more up to date, and this is Jackie Kay. And these are modern national poets of Scotland who have been appointed by the devolved Scottish Government, and I'll say a bit more about that in what follows. So that's who I'll try and cover. So I've got three examples, and I've also given on your handouts other examples, most of which are mainly in English, okay, and some of which are currently taught in Scottish secondary schools. So that's kind of dictated some of my selection today. I've got to distill Scottish poetry into three poets and three poems. That's quite a hard task, so I've just tried to get a range. Okay, so let's start with this chap. So as I said, this is Scotland's national bard, Robert Burns. Burns is born in 1759, so we're looking at the late 18th century, and we're looking at Burns being productive at the end of the European Enlightenment, moving into the Romantic period. And I'm going to say a wee thing about Romanticism in a second. Burns's first collection, just for a bit of context, is poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect. Well, why do I mention that? Well, you'll notice that title there, chiefly in the Scottish dialect. So the thing about Robert Burns is he's known for writing not in English, but in Scots. Okay? But chiefly in the Scottish dialect. It's not entirely Scots. And what I want to show today is that Burns will move between English and Scots, even in some of the poems I've selected, which are predominantly in English. So maybe we're thinking about strategies to deal with regional variation within Britain, but in this case, variation within Scotland. If you're teaching a poem by a Scottish author that's written in English, they might throw in the occasional Scots phrase, what do you do? Okay, so that's what I want to try and work with today. So Burns is doing that. Burns' fame, part of it is a mythology. Burns was born into a really humble farming background. He didn't go to university. He was actually quite well educated at home, but the great and the good and the critics all proclaimed him a heaven-taught ploughman, an original genius. Burns seemed to stand out in terms of his artistry. Much of his later career is not producing other collections of poetry as poetry, but collecting and rewriting the lyrics for songs. So another piece of context there is when you look at Burns on the printed page, quite often you're dealing with song lyrics. These were meant to be performed. We might read them as disembodied poems, but they were very much there. Maybe new lyrics to an old tune, you did that quite a lot, or working with sort of folk tradition, etc., reworking those lyrics. So that's one thing to think about, particularly an example I'm about to show you. Burns dies at the age of 37, very young, but the celebrity doesn't stop at his death. In fact, what you get is a cult of celebrity after his death. In Scotland, in diaspora communities, all across diaspora communities, not just in Scotland, you find them in America, for example. You get Burns and clubs appearing that celebrate the memory of the life and the work of Robert Burns, and you've also got other cultural commemorations. So 25th of January, those of you who've been to Scotland in January will probably know this, every 25th of January is Burns Night. People celebrate Robert Burns. You maybe sit in your home and have haggis, or you might attend a Burns supper, which is a sort of public event, which again serves haggis. There's a lot of haggis involved, but that's because of Burns' poem to a haggis. Burns' fame is such as that, why is haggis a national dish of Scotland? Probably because of Robert Burns. That's the kind of thing. We've got a lot of our cultural reference points come via Burns. But it's a really quite remarkable thing, because, people don't read a lot of poetry in popular culture nowadays, yeah? Yet, you've still got a national event that commemorates a poet. So it's quite an unusual thing. Anyway, so that's Burns' fame, or a potted version of it. I just want to cover some themes, because I've given you a handout with some Burns poems. I will just give general themes, just to maybe help it, when you're ranging about Burns' poetry, think about the kind of things that he's interested in. Burns is at the tail end of the Enlightenment. We're moving into Romanticism, or early Romanticism. So Burns was dead by 1796, but some of his verse shows the concerns of Romanticism. Two of the things I would point here. Of course, we associate this sort of period with the rediscovery of, for want of a better term, folk culture. You've got people collecting songs that have been sung, tales that have been told, and writing them down, transcribing them for the first time. So Robert Burns is doing quite a lot of that. There's a song that's sung at New Year, Auld Lang Syne. Yeah. Now, Robert Burns is not the first person to write a version of that. He actually takes an existing lyric. There are earlier versions, variants, and the only thing he preserves from the earlier versions is one line. The first line, "Should old acquaintance be forgot." Burns completely rewrites the song for a modern audience, an audience of diaspora, an audience who are travelling, because this poem in many ways is about people who are away from each other. You're celebrating, but remembering friends who can't be with you at New Year. Yeah? So Burns taking existing folk songs, resetting them. Also, another thing that we find with Romanticism, and this is not Burns' term, this is William Wordsworth, that poetry speaks the language of ordinary men. So moving into Romanticism, we've got the rejection of the kind of high poetic diction that you find in, say, neoclassicism of the early 18th century, and a verse that seems to approximate the language of ordinary people. So that celebration of the ordinary, the celebration of folk culture, we find that in Burns as well. A couple of other themes that you find. One of the main things I think commentators spot with Robert Burns is the way in which his verse moves between the local and the universal. By the local, I would mean things like, right, here we've got a poet who is writing quite often in a dialect of Scots from Ayrshire in the 18th century. That's going to limit your verse. It's going to maybe even limit your audience, yeah? Because it seems very specific. None of us are farmers in 18th century Ayrshire, yet we can still read Robert Burns, and one of the reasons I think, generalising here, that people still read Robert Burns, or one of the reasons for his international success, is that he seems to address what are broader concerns. I'll call them universal here, but concerns that other people can relate to. So, To a Mouse, for example, is one of his well-known poems. This is the poem from which his proverbial lines, "The best laid schemes of mice and men gang after gley, the best laid schemes of mice and men often go wrong." That's a line that becomes proverbial in America, for example. So I think what he's addressing there in that poem, in terms of the universal, is about the relationship between human beings and the animal world, and the relationship between human beings and environment. So broader concerns that people can really, begin to interrogate and understand. So that's the sort of things, just in broad themes: celebration of ordinary life, celebration of the virtues coming from ordinary people, that the best of a nation consists not in those at the top of society, but people at the bottom of society. Celebration of human nature, flawed human nature, shall we say. You're not saying what human nature should be, you're not condemning people for what they're not quite matching up to, you're celebrating for people for what they are. It's a forgiving attitude towards human nature. And with that, it's a forgiving attitude towards, or a celebration of simple human pleasures. Sociability, conviviality, yes, drinking, love, and dare I say, even sex. Okay, so you find these things as common concerns in Burns' poems. And with that, many of his poems are church satires. They're satires of churchmen, like Holy Willie's Prayer. This is about a hypocritical Presbyterian worshipper praying to his God and asking God to smite his enemies. He's a religious hypocrite. That shows Burns' disdain for religious hypocrisy. You know, those who say thou shalt not, those who think they're better than you. So, religious satire, social satire as well, quite often aimed at those at the top of society. Lords, dukes, kings, those kind of things. And also, quite often the themes that you'd find coming out at the start of, I guess by the 1790s at least, concerns for freedom, for liberty. That's very much how Robert Burns is read in the United States, for example. Throughout the 19th century, he's read as a poet of democracy. I'm not sure how they read him today, you know what's happening to democracy in America, but very much that is the reading that you get. He's admired by many people for those kind of concerns. So those are sort of common themes that you might think about in the background, but I want to do something a little more specific today. So this is my first example, okay? Now this is advisedly because this is a kind of stereotypical view of Scotland, and that's one of the first points I want to make, you know? Because if you think of Scotland, you might think of this kind of stuff, yeah? Hills and lochs and glens, and which are there, you know? But remember, the population don't live there. They live in the Central Belt, you know? That's where the majority population are. It's mercantile, it's commercial, it's industrial. We work in Glasgow, for example, which is the largest city in Scotland. You can see hills in the distance, but it's not like that. Yeah? This is a kind of romantic version of Scotland, isn't it? So I think one point I'd make is, you know, when you're teaching Scottish literature, people might come with preconceptions about Scotland, and I think it's really important that you add nuance, that you kind of problematise those stereotypes. Yeah, I'll try and do a bit of that here with what I hope is a simple verse. So, my heart's in the Highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the Highlands, chasing the deer. Chasing the wild deer and following the roe, my heart's in the Highlands wherever I go. Farewell to the Highlands, farewell to the north. Farewell to the birthplace of valour, the country of worth. Wherever I wander, wherever I rove, the hills of the Highlands, forever I love. Farewell to the mountains, high covered with snow. Farewell to the straths and green valleys below. Farewell to the forests and wild-hanging woods. Farewell to the torrents and loud-pouring floods. And then the same verse again, my heart's in the Highlands. So I've chosen that because it's a fairly simple one. It's in English, as you can see. It's an example in terms of form. It's a song. Yeah, I mean, it's clearly a song. If you're dealing with song, you can look up, and I think this is generally good practice, is just play a version. The students go to YouTube, type it in, yeah? But even there, because we're talking about problematising stereotypes, yeah, quite often you type a Burns song into YouTube, and you'll get a kind of highly Scotified, stereotypical rendition of it that seems to just confirm stereotypes, yeah. You know, a piper and a bagpipe playing or something like that, you know, it might reinforce those kind of preconceptions, yeah. But it's good still to hear the song. You can hear how the lyrics might fit it. And here, you know, you've got 4 lines. It's a quatrain. 4 tetrameter lines, these are the standard aspects of song. 4 strong stresses or beats in the line. My heart's in the Highlands, my heart is not here. Fits fairly well with music, of course. You know, music with 4 beats at the bar, 4/4 time. It's got other aspects of song, the refrain. My heart's in the Highlands, my heart is not here, in 1 and in 4. You know, we do lyrics nowadays, might call it the chorus, the repeated elements. And also the repetition as well, the farewell to here. So that's very clearly a song you might want to play to them. If you can sing, you might even want to sing it to them. I can't, so sorry, I'm not going to sing today, but you'll thank me for it. So the other thing though that I want to look at here is, if we're looking at that and as a kind of stereotypical view of Scotland, yeah? A few things to remember. So Burns here writes this at a specific point in his career when he's transitioning from being a regional bard, just at the start of his career. He's transitioning from being a regional bard who's in Ayrshire, which is the west of Scotland, in the lowlands, from a farming background, to becoming a national bard. And he's just published his first collection of poetry. He's become a bit of a success, and he's got a bit of money, which allows him to tour Scotland. And this allows him to this is a transitional point at which he stops being a regional bard and starts writing about Scotland, if you like, yeah? becomes a national bard. And what we have here is his perception of Scotland, yeah? But that ties in with Romanticism. Remember, there's a cliche about Romantic poetry, there's nature poetry. Quite a lot of poetry is about nature, that's not a distinguishing mark. But let's face it, when we look at Romanticism, quite often the style of nature poetry is about the poet's perception of nature. It's not about nature, it's about how the poet views nature. You might be looking at their psychological processes, looking at their vision of the natural world. And what we've got here is a poetic prospect. Because we're in the Highlands, but this isn't a specific place. Has anyone been to the Highlands of Scotland? Yeah? Yeah, good. You know, yeah, there's lots of landscape like that, but you do visit specific places, yeah? Dare say even specific places with people in them. Yeah? Barnes isn't giving that, it's a kind of composite image. It's got a tourist perception, he's touring. And he's giving you this sort of composite idea of the Highlands, it's not the actual location. And the Highlands is an area of remote beauty and also of sublimity. And I use those terms deliberately because these are the large aesthetic categories of Romanticism, the sublime and the beautiful. For example here, well, the beauty, we know what beauty is, but the sublime is the awe-inspiring aspects of nature, yeah? You know, the terrifying aspects of nature or the powerful aspects of nature, the things that make you go. So in this case it might be rivers and spate and waterfalls, torrents and loud pouring floods. Yeah. So that's what we've got. I think what we've got here is Burns romanticising the Highlands from an outsider's perspective. It's part of a wider process that we might be aware of, because we spoke earlier about people having sort of stereotypical perceptions of Scotland as rooted in Highland culture. That series of images has its own history, and it really does emerge from this kind of period, Romantic period. All across Europe, of course, where you find like modern nations coming up with a modern idea of modern nation states and the difference of one nation from another, and the symbols of nationhood, or the modern symbols of nationhood. And in this period, what happens in Scotland is that the Highlands become representative of Scotland as a whole. So all the sort of symbols that and the trappings and the images of Scotland that we kind of associate when you go to Scotland, Celts, Lochs, Glens, Pipers, warriors, I don't know. It's all from a marginal Highland culture. It's not from the culture of the lowland where most people live. Yeah? And that becomes like a blanket identity. And that really is emerging from the Romantic period. And Burns is part of that here, I think. You know, he's exemplifying the Highlands as this kind of place of national greatness, the birthplace of valour, the country of worth. Okay? So, basic point, which I'll repeat again, you know, if you're dealing with that and you're dealing with Scotland, is really just to start to challenge some of these preconceptions. It's not, you know, you might come with those sort of beliefs, or your students might come with those beliefs about what Scotland's like, and just add that nuance, just see, you know, is this real, what we're being presented here. Now, I've given you some other suggestions. They're on the anthology. You might want to look at them later in the workshop, okay? It's really up to you. The two ones I've selected is My Heart's in Highland and Robert Bruce's address to his troops at Bannockburn, where Burns is really showing his position as a national bard because he's talking about the nation. Yeah. The other two that I've included on your anthology are Song Composed in August and Red Red Rose. Both of those are love songs, but there's so much more. I think what you'll find in them is that they actually address the relationship between humans and the environment, humans and the natural world. Okay? Very much areas of contemporary concern. So please do have a look at them later on. I won't cover them all today, I'm just giving you a whistle-stop tour of 3 different poets, okay? But they are very good. Scots were here though, because, sorry, that's the other one. Okay, but I will look a wee bit at the language now. Just Burns, just to note one thing about Burns is Burns has been read internationally. You will find translations of Burns into most world languages. There's even translations of Burns into Esperanto. You can find quite a lot of things. A lot of interest from, I don't know, Spanish translations, Russian translations, throughout the 20th century, Chinese translations, for example. And also in Germany, there are German translations of Burns. They started to appear in the 19th century. There was quite an interest in Burns in the post-Romantic period. One of the big scholars of Burns was the first German biographer, Hans Hecht. who lived 1876 to 1946. But one of the things I want to point out is just the language thing, because you're obviously teaching English, yeah? And you're going to be dealing, if you're teaching an English language poem by a Scottish writer like Frozen Scots, yeah? What do you do? And one of the problems that the German translators had at Burns, just to show you some of the challenges, yeah, is this. Even the earliest commentators on Burns were certain of his artistry, but yet recognised that he wrote in a Scottish linguistic form which was difficult to translate. This recognition has posed another question for translators. Wie Scottish aber ist Burns Sprach, sorry, that's my German pronunciation, yeah? Or how Scottish is actually is Burns' language. This ununiform language, this Scots which intersects with English, could not readily be translated into either into the standard High German or into a German dialect without doing some damage to the spirit of Burns' art. Yeah? So I'm going to show you an example there. And again, I've chosen examples that are mostly in English, but you will hopefully see what I mean just from this example, where we look at here, which is Robert Bruce's address to Bannockburn. Okay? I'm going to do just a wee potted history of Scots, if I may. I'm assuming that most people wouldn't know what I meant by Scots, or I'll do it anyway. Yeah. Okay, I'll try it. Okay, this is my point. Really brief history of the Scots language. Okay, right. So Scotland's official languages are Gaelic, which is spoken up here. See the green. Okay, marginal language spoken. It's a Celtic language. It's from the Celtic family of languages. All Gaelic speakers are bilingual. They speak Gaelic and English. Yeah, we're not doing Gaelic today because I can't speak Gaelic, but do look at Gaelic in translation. So that's spoken up there. You've got Scottish Standard English. Okay, so that's Scotland's version of English, which has its own peculiarities, its own reflections. You might find it in professional life. I'm trying to think of an example. Outside, we might use the term out with. That's a Scots term, isn't it? Yeah, for outside. Yeah, something could be out with something. It's kind of a Scottish version of that. But there's other terms, which I don't have time to go into. And British Sign Language, of course, as well. That's a thing. So Scots and English are, of course, from the same group of languages as German and Dutch. Yeah, so they are all West Germanic languages. Some things that you'll find in the older Scots might be similar to pronunciation in German, for example. England, the word light. Yeah, in Scotland, the old word for it was licht. See that hard CH? Yeah. Yep. So. And you get things like that. So the CH instead of GH, licht, nicht, those kind of folked for thought, that used to be a feature of older Scots. I, in fact, remember my grandparents speaking like that. Maybe not so much now, you won't hear that so much now, but that was something that I think you see kind of similarities. English and Scots are cognate in the same way as, I guess, degree of mutual comprehensibility between Spanish and Portuguese, or the Romance languages, stuff like that. But more than that, most Scots are schooled in English. There is no formal schooling in Scots. Corey mentioned earlier how there are Scottish texts taught in our curriculum. That only started this century. Yeah. So before that, certainly when I was at school back in the 19th century, the tendency was to, the view that speaking Scots was somehow speaking English wrong. The cultural attitudes was like it's a lower class sort of language. If you want to get in the world, speak properly, speak English. Yeah. So that kind of idea. So most Scots speakers will move between English and Scots, sometimes in the same sentence. Yeah. So you're dealing with those kind of variations. Yeah. Evolved from the same root as English, as modern English, but you can think of them as like they're coming from the same kind of language by Anglian speakers who settled there. But they take on a separate evolution in the medieval period. They sort of diverge a bit. Yeah? And the high point for Scots, socially, is probably the late medieval period going into the Renaissance. It's spoken at court. It's used for official documentation. Scots is an orate language. It's used for reading epic poetry. But what happens after that is it goes in a kind of social decline. It's still spoken. You'll hear Scots spoken in the streets of Scotland, or different versions of it. But there's a bit of a social decline. There's various reasons for that, which I don't have time to go into, but there are various forces. For example, the Protestant Reformation, part of the Reformation, as you're aware, is about worshipping in your own language, not in Latin. You don't need a priest to mediate between you and God. Well, the Scottish Reformers worked with English Reformers to produce a Geneva Bible in English, If English becomes the language of religion, it's going to become, at that time, the language of education, and increasingly in the church schools, and also by the 18th century, the universities, there's a move from Latin to English, yeah? Not to Scots. So Scots might be spoken at home. I'm generalising here, sorry, because I don't have a lot of time. Scots might be spoken at home, but it's not in a formal education context, yeah? So that's what we found. So you've got this kind of, from that period, from the Protestant Reformation, late 16th century, through to the Act of Union, 1707, the formation of Great Britain. England and Scotland unite to form this new country. You've got these pressures against Scots in professional and literary, even literary contexts. But you've also got a reaction against kind of that change. Robert Burns is known as a poet of the vernacular revival. Vernacular, one's tongue, yeah. The revival of Scots language in poetry. He's not the only person critiquing that. And in some ways that's a cultural response to the Act of Union, to Scotland losing its status as an independent dynastic state and now being part of this larger unit. Okay? So a cultural reaction there. So hopefully that gives a wee sense of where Scots sits, that when you've got Scottish writers, they might, even though a lot of Scottish writers do actually write in English, or a mixture, but they will throw in Scots phrases, and they might do it for deliberate effect, they might do it for a specific purpose, yeah? Robert Burns makes a deliberate choice, because Burns, like us, he was also schooled in English. He wasn't schooled in Scots. He makes a deliberate choice, he's making a statement by choosing a specific form of language. So being aware of that kind of difference, that subtlety, how it ties up with a sense of identity, I think becomes quite important, yeah? And I'm going to show you, I'll finally get into the example of language here, but Burns's language, it's a kind of, sometimes called a synthetic Scots. So, I mean, what does the term synthetic suggest to you? Anybody? Yeah, please. Synthetic.
Basically, it isn't real and it was constructed to appeal to a broader audience.
Yeah, it's constructed or it's artificial, yeah, it's synthesized from various sources. I mean, I think that's the thing that sometimes you say about it, because it's a poetic language, it approximates how people would speak, but it's not identical to how people would speak, you know, grammatically or in terms of grammar, etc. So I'm going to show you finally an example, and this is going to come over to you, okay? So this is Robert Bruce's address to his troops at Bannockburn. Scots wha hae wi Wallace bled, Scots swam Bruce as after led. Welcome to your gory bed, or to victory. I'm not going to read the whole thing out because I just want to stop in that first stanza. So it's over to you now for a wee minute or two, okay? Firstly, just think about this poem as a whole, yeah? Or this song. And how many words are actually in Scots, okay? Yeah? And more specifically, let's just work for this first stanza, just to show you, because if you're working with learners, this is this is the exercise I do with international students. Who are sometimes speakers of English as a second language, just to show them how close Scots and English are, or if you encounter a Scots word, don't panic. And don't necessarily reach for the dictionary, you don't always have to. Yeah? You can work out from the context. So here, think pronunciation. Yeah? So I'm going to even just try to build confidence by glossing into English. So the first term, Scots, should be fine. Yeah? What? What do you think "wha" means in English? Exactly. It's just a slightly different vowel sound. Yeah. So an English speaker might say "who." In Scots, at this period, you might say "wha." Okay. Hey. Scots who hey, and it's not the corn. I'll give you a clue. There's a letter missing.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I'm sorry. Were you? Okay. Way. Yes, with. So it's fairly straightforward. That's just elision. So a Scots speaker there would not pronounce the TH, yeah? So they would say Scots who have with Wallace bled, they'd say Scots wha hae wi Wallace bled. And even you've got a nice friendly thing, elision there, the little apostrophe that's actually signalling that. That's sometimes called the apologetic apostrophe. It's apologising to readers of English that there appears to be something missing from the word. Scots who have, with Wallace bled, Scots, wham, Bruce, wham, not the band, the 80s, sadly. Wham. Sorry, somebody said it.
Who?
It's whom, yeah, it's the same principle as what, yeah? This is whom. Bruce says afton.
Often?
Yeah. So I think I think we're seeing it, In this case, you're confronting with this kind of, looks like a broad Scots accent, but it's just slight changes in pronunciation. Now you won't always encounter that. I will show examples later on when you actually get peculiarly Scots terms, phrases, idiomatic phrases or words, or even just parts of Scots lexicon, which don't have English equivalents. But I think it's really quite easy. If you actually look throughout this poem, there isn't actually that much that is Scots. There's the effective Scots. So maybe understand why German translators had a problem like saying what Burns' language was. Is it dialect? Is it Scots? Is it English? What is it? Yeah. But for your purposes, in a classroom, if you can get words like that, don't panic. Yeah. Read it out aloud. See, this is how a Scots speaker might pronounce who, have, with. Yeah. So I'll just give you I've given you a little thing there just to bring it. So basically, what you've got here, Robert Bruce is the historic medieval king, King Robert Bruce. He is a national hero by this stage when Burns, hundreds of years later, is writing a poem about him, giving an address before a very decisive battle in Scottish and English history, the Battle of Bannockburn 1314, when a Scots force defeated a much larger English force and basically ended England's claim to feudal lordship over Scotland. So he's given this as a patriotic address for a very patriotic battle, a really historically significant battle. And you can imagine why he might choose Scots or partly use Scots for this address, yeah? It's patriotic, so why not get somebody speaking in a patriotic language? It's not historically accurate. Robert the Bruce is a medieval nobleman, and he probably spoke at that stage, he probably spoke some Celtic and an older version of French. He wouldn't have spoken Scots. But historical accuracy is not the thing here. Burns is writing in the late 18th century, and he's giving a sort of 18th century patriotic view of history, and he chooses a language that's appropriate to that. And these are simple principles here. You've got the vowel difference that we've seen, yeah? So often, say for so. Just how Scots speakers would speak, yeah? An older version of Scots might have this principle, which we could call V deletion. So we saw that. Hey in Scots is just the English have. Burns, for example, will write things like address to the deal. The deal's a war with the excise man. The deal is the devil. The V is missing from devil. Yeah. So V deletion is a common feature of Burns' verse. And then other ones which are just they're signalled with an apostrophe. Way for with, for fall, and so forth, so on and so forth. I'm from a hometown. My hometown's called Falkirk. Falkirk. Kirk there is church. Similar in German. Yeah. But it's pronounced by the locals as Falkirk. You drop the L. Yeah. So sometimes you're just, it's about those variations. So, right. So that's my older example. I'm going to jump forward now, a couple hundred years almost, and move to modern markers. There is a logic to this because what I'm doing now is moving from the national bard, Robert Burns, to the appointed national poets of Scotland. So a bit of constitutional history. 1999, Scotland opens a devolved parliament in Holyrood in Edinburgh. First parliament that Scotland's had in a couple hundred years, yeah, a few hundred years. And they start to appoint a kind of poet laureate or a national poet of Scotland, officially appoint him. The first person to get that title is Edwin Morgan. He is the first Scottish macker. So the term there, macker, is often used. That's an old medieval term it's a Scots word for maker, and it's actually from Aristotle's term for poets as makers, the makers of verse, creators, yeah? So the modern macker or national poet of Scotland, there's been 5 in the modern age. Morgan was the first. Now that was late in his career. Morgan, born in 1920, had a long productive career. I've given you a small sample of Morgan's verse here, 3 out of loads, yeah. But I just wanted to show you the kind of range that you'll find in Morgan. You'll get everything from translations, this old Anglo-Saxon story, Beowulf. He does a very good translation of that actually, way before Seamus Heaney. And Scottish Poetry on the website, you'll see a lot of things like his instamatic poems from the 1970s. So those are poems that are snapshots. I don't know if you remember these cameras, you just like do a automatic camera and it pushes out, it prints out your photograph from the camera. So you've got a snapshot in time, and he turns that into poetry. Yeah? So he tries these different forms. He's got love poems. Well, let's do it. The good thing about Morgan is the kind of nuances to his love poems. Morgan was gay, yeah, but because of the legal situation in Britain at the time and in Scotland at the time, he could not openly express his homosexuality. Yeah? So it adds an interesting dimension and interesting nuance to his love poetry. And in fact, even with self-expression, I mean, what you'll find Morgan, quite often it isn't expressing himself. Quite often it's things that speak, objects. The computer's first Christmas card, where he's got a computer trying to come out with this garbled message that's celebrating Christmas time. He's often got experimental languages, which I'll show you in a second. Okay? Concrete poetry and performance poetry as well. He's influenced by concrete poetry. Just to give you a very quick, I'm going back to the stereotypes here, okay? But just to give you a quick sample, which I want to use to show how playful Morgan is while being experimental. Okay, he experiments with form, but he's a very playful poet. Often uses quite a lot of humour. It's not earnest experimentalism, it's something else. It's kind of joyful, yeah? This is Loch Ness Monster song. I won't read this out because I can't. What language is this?
Scots.
It looks like it, doesn't it? It's Loch Ness Monster language, which is the other official language of Scotland. But this looks like nonsense, it looks like verse for kids, etc. But it's both concrete poetry and performance poetry. Yeah? There's actually a situation here. Even though we can't understand the language, we can work out what's going on here. Yeah? So the Loch Ness Monster here surfaces, question marks at the front, so he's looking about. And then he's kind of grumpy, as monsters tend to be, you know. He gets a bit cranky, he looks about, and then he decides to, you know, so he kind of like does all this thing, blah, 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 you know. And then he goes back into the water. And that's him descending. And he's figured again. And actually, you can see videos, I think there's still videos of Morgan, I think they're online of him doing this, it's really good, you know. He actually does read it all out, you know. I mean, that's just a bit fun, but he actually does quite a lot of experiments. And if you want to see another experiment, one that does a similar thing with what appears to be a garbled language, a made-up language, I've included The First Men in Mercury, where he takes a kind of science fiction scenario where Earthlings go to Mercury and take me to your leader, and the Mercurians speak Mercurian, and he makes up that language. So you'll see how that sort of pans out, and these problems of understanding people across cultures, across different languages. Okay. But anyway, I'm going to go to a very different kind of poem. I'll read it out and just have a think. Okay, this is again over to you. What kind of poem is this in terms of its form? And what else do you spot? I mean, what else? What's it about? You know, those kind of things. Just see if you can get a quick sense. Okay. A mean wind wanders through the backcourt trash. Hackles on puddles rise. Old mattresses puff briefly and subside. Clay fortresses of brick and brack spill out some ash. 4 stories have no windows left to smash. But in the 5th, a chip sill buttresses mother and daughter, the last mistresses of that black block condemned to stand, not crash. Around them the cracks deepen, the rats crawl, the kettle whimpers on a crazy hob. Roses of mould grow from ceiling to wall. The man lies late since he has lost his job. Smokes on one elbow, letting his coughs fall. Thinly into an air too thin to rob. So how do we look at that, okay? Firstly, any sense of what the form of that poem is? It's a very conventional form of poetry from Europe. It's okay if you don't, because I'll reveal all of them. It is a sonnet, yes, well done. 14 lines, okay? Always a kind of nice signifier, just count the number of lines. I always do that with students, you know. It's a very traditional form, in fact, as well. It's a specific kind of sonnet. There are 2 sort of main groups or families of sonnet. There's the Italian sonnet, the Petrarchan sonnet, or the English sonnet, the Shakespearean sonnet, as it's sometimes known. Yeah. Okay. Anything else anybody spot about this, in terms of content? Well, my next question is then, okay, what do you think a sonnet traditionally or conventionally? What would sonnets be about? Do you think back in the Renaissance, say? I don't know if anyone studied the sonnet to any degree.
Love.
Yeah. Usually aristocratic love, courtly love. Yeah. It's usually like maybe a male speaker who's an aristocrat talking about an impossible object of desire. Yeah. Using this very artificial, very stylized, very constructed form. Sonnets don't happen by accident. Yeah. To express powerful emotions, and that's quite often studying the sonnet point out the sort of artificiality of the verse versus the sort of passion. But what's Morgan writing about here? So the traditional conventional sonnet is about love. Yeah.
Unemployment and decay.
Yeah, unemployment decay is probably the opposite of aristocratic smoochies. It's a very different thing. So basically, what I'm saying here, right, is how Morgan will use conventional forms in unconventional ways. He will go back to a Renaissance form and he'll do it. And in fact, he's got two collections. Sorry, I'm just going to flick back a wee bit to show you them. From Glasgow to Saturn, yeah, which Corey mentioned earlier, which is wrong. Glasgow Sonnets, sorry, I'm in the wrong line, okay? Glasgow Sonnets, so it's a series of sonnets about Glasgow. Sonnet sequence. Shakespeare does a very famous sonnet sequence in English, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, all that sort of stuff, yeah? Well, that's in the Renaissance. Morgan does sonnets about Glasgow, and then sonnets from Scotland, which is that's in the 1970s. 1980s, he does a collection called Sonnets from Scotland, which are about the prehistory, history, present, and future of Scotland, told from the perspective of time-travelling aliens. Because why not? It's a really good collection. So that actually ties into one of Morgan's other concerns, which is Morgan has a great interest in science fiction. Corey did mention the collection from Glasgow to Saturn earlier. On one hand, Morgan is the poet of the city of Glasgow. He writes about Glasgow. He is very much centred there. His poetry is centred there. But on the other hand, he's writing about the universe. He's writing about cosmic things. He's writing about space. He's writing about science fiction. So that collection perhaps shows that range. Okay. But anyway, I'll flick on. So that's what we're looking here. We're looking at a sonnet from a sonnet sequence. It's actually Glasgow sonnet number 1. He's writing in the 1970s about the city of Glasgow. So we've moved from Burns's Highlands and the romantic version of Scotland to a very kind of real Glasgow, a Glasgow of urban poverty, of decay. Yeah, as you said, decay. And what we've got here, though, is, if you look at the form, a really, really, really conventional form. Petrarchan or Italian sonnet, 14 lines, the metre is iambic pentameter. I won't count the stresses here, but it is, or roughly approximates that. Now, the Italian sonnet, if you haven't studied the sonnet, right, one of the markers of the Italian sonnet is it can be subdivided into 2 parts, which are the first 8 lines is the octave, yeah, and the sestet. With something changing, a turn or what they call a volta between the 2 parts, yeah. So you might notice a change in sense, a change in language, some kind of shift, yeah? And here we actually have a shift. We've got a shift from the outside of the building, the courtyard of the tenement, these big sort of like, slums basically where people had to live in Glasgow at the time, to the interior, goes from outside to the inside, to where the man sits smoking in an air too thin to rob. So really quite standard use of a form. But the key thing here is, what does he do with that form? He's using it to write about urban issues. He's using it to write about the real world in the present. People, unemployment, poverty, despair even, yeah? So I think that's one of the things. And it might be even the form, this is the form that's usually used, as I said, by aristocrats to express their love back in the Renaissance. But here, he's using it for ordinary people. Does it lend a dignity to their experience, even though they live in such despair? Yeah? So that's what you think about, because you get these, I think Corey put this quite, really quite eloquently, you get these different versions of Scotland, yeah? And I think that's really, really important, that you don't just give them one version, give them the different voices, yeah? Just another few notes on this one, sorry. So just things to notice. I think some things that stand out here, the poor quality of life. I mean, he even talks about it starts with air and finishes with air. It's a mean wind at the start that wanders through the backward crash, and then it finishes on Again, inside even the air is poor. An air too thin or an air too poor to rob. People in this poem are also very passive. You can notice if you look at the objects in this poem, or the students would hopefully notice, how it's things here that are active. Old mattresses puff briefly and subside. Clay fortresses of brick and brack spill out some ash. All the objects it's been, all the kind of detritus, all the things that have been thrown out the windows of tenements and end up in the courtyard, yeah? All the sort of abandoned items. Mother and daughter are the last mistresses of that black block condemned to stand, you know? So they are basically condemned to stay in this place. And even like, you know, the way that the cracks in the wall, the cracks deepen as if by their own volition, the rats crawl, the kettle whimpers. So, you know, that sort of thing. People are sort of powerless in this environment, and I think that's reflected in the way in which he makes the environment around them active, yeah? So, anyway, that's some of the things. I think that some interesting things here as well, like roses of mould go, because we don't really think of mould as a beautiful thing, but roses are. That's very interesting the way that, you know, even the things that you would expect to prettify their life, roses, aren't actually flowers, it's the black mould growing across the wall. So that's Morgan as the poet of Glasgow. I've included a couple of other examples of Morgan doing different things at different points in his career in the anthology. Okay, so the first one, Men and Mercury, which you see here, is a dialogue between Earthlings and Mercurians. Don't worry if you can't understand the Mercurian, because it all becomes clear, that's part of the point of it. But here, what you've actually got is, as the poem progresses, the Mercurians, okay, learn to speak English, but the Earthlings increasingly become Mercurian. So if you think about colonial encounters, what happens in colonisation, hybridity, yeah? You think about the way in which, you know, you might go in as a colonial power and try and impose your ways on in our culture, but that culture also transforms you, yeah? So that's quite good. So that's the thing with negotiating language. You can have a look at that in your own time. I won't cover much of that today. I've got Trio, which is a really nice little thing, a nice poem about Glasgow. Buchanan Street, which is a main shopping street in the city of Glasgow. And then Slate, which is from the Sonnets from Scotland sequence, okay? So I've included them, please do have a look at them. But just in the interest of time, I now want to move on a bit and look at our third and final speaker, our final poet, sorry, I'm speaking, Jackie Kay. Jackie Kay is, like Edwin Morgan, they are taught in schools at the moment. So Jackie Kay, in high school, students get a selection and get Jackie Kay's verse as a standard set part of the curriculum. And even with the curriculum refresh that we mentioned, Jackie Kay is still very much on that curriculum. There are lots of different examples from Kay, as well as Morgan, sorry, I should have said that, on the Scottish Poetry Library website. I've put the link there. I am happy to share these slides with anybody who wants them, okay? So that you've got the links, you can check that out. Just a bit about Jackie Kay. So Jackie Kay was the third modern Scots marker. She was appointed in 2016. The way it worked, it was Edmund Morgan, then Liz Lockhead, another great poet you might want to check out, then Jackie Kay, then Kathleen Jamie. Kathleen Jamie is really concerned with ecology and writes really great environmental poetry and prose as well, actually. So Kathleen Jamie was the second last marker, and the current National Poet of Scotland, or marker, is Peter Mackay, who is a Gaelic poet. He writes in a language that I can't speak, Gaelic. So that we've had 5 modern markers.
And he has often been to mines.
Has he really? I didn't know that. Oh,
Yes,
sorry.
translated him into German.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. So worth checking out, definitely. Yeah. So just with Jackie Kay, oh sorry, I've kept slowing down. So Jackie Kay, born in Edinburgh 1961 to a Scottish mother and Nigerian father, adopted at birth by a white couple living in Glasgow. Happy childhood in spite of racial bullying at school, remains close to her adoptive parents. And just a bit of it, she said that all writers draw on their own experience, and a lot of my experience has been heightened. Thus, her poem sequence, Adoption Papers, considers the experience of adoption, while the consciousness of being black in Britain and concerns with gender identity, she herself identified herself as lesbian early in her career, are also constants in her work. So just keep that in mind, okay? Because that's often we find these things in her poems, and you will see some of these concerns surfacing in the selection I've given you, or even in the selection on the Scottish Poetry website more widely. You'll find issues about identity, but the idea of identity not as fixed. Identity is fluid, something that can change depending on circumstance, depending on where you find yourself. Okay. Also, the question of belonging. I say the question of belonging because often Jackie Kay's poems navigate that sort of. It's like a sense of belonging and not belonging at the same time. Having a very traditional working class white or majority white upbringing, but also being black and not quite accepted by kids at school and things like that. So we navigate that kind of difficult thing about belonging. And that leads on to the next one. Race, gender, sexuality, these are constant themes in the work. But she's also, and I'm going to show you an example of this, also concerned about language and voice. As she says here, most of my work is voice-based. Voice is the most important thing to me. So in that sense, language is the most important thing to me. Because once I've got a voice for a character, whether it's a poem, monologue, short story, narrative, novel, once I've got the voice of the person, I can run with it. It's probably just a good time to just spot that. You know, I am generalising quite a lot here today, just for brevity. But one thing you might know about the three examples here, Burns, Morgan, and Kay, is that they use lyric poetry, okay, fine. They base their poetry quite often on experience, but they don't always use lyric as self-expression. Quite often it's a useful exercise with these particular poets to ask, who is speaking? Because it's not always, we can't always identify the speaker with the poet. In some cases, you really can't, you know, such as I think there's a poem where Burns speaks as a dying sheep. You know, if you don't recognise it at the start of the poem, you get kind of lost, yeah. Or Morgan is the Loch Ness Monster, or as a computer, or as something non-human, you know, who is speaking. And you find that in Jackie Kay as well, but often she'll use different voices, sometimes different voices in the same series of poems. The Adoption Papers is told from the perspectives of mothers and daughters, and things like that. Quite often they're using dramatic speakers or the voices of others. Okay, so that's just one thing to bear in mind. Don't always assume that the speaker, the voice speaking, is the same as the poet. Yeah. So my example today is Oak Tongue. When I was 8, I was forced south. Not long after, when I opened my mouth, a strange thing happened. I lost my Scottish accent. Words fell off my tongue. Egypt, Drich, Wabbit, Crabbit, Stummer, Chupa, Heatbanger. So you are, so I'm your. See you, see my mass, shut your giggy or gee the malky. And don't worry about these terms, I'm going to explain them in a second. Okay. My own vowels started to stretch like my bones, and I turned my back on Scotland. Words disappeared in the dead of night. New words marched in. Ghastly, awful, quite dreadful. Scones said like stones. Pokey hats and ice cream cones. Oh, where does all my words go? My old words, my lost words. Did you ever feel sad when you lost a word? Did you ever try and call it back, like calling in the sea? If I could have found my words, wandering, I swear I would have taken them in, swallowed them whole, knocked them back. Out in the English soil, my old words buried themselves. It made my mother's blood boil. I cried one day with the wrong sound in my mouth. I wanted them back, I wanted my old accent back, my old tongue, my dour, sour Scottish tongue, sing-songy. I wanted to get loudy. So I'll explain a bit of that in a second, okay? So, what we've got here is, again, it's a poem based on experience, because Jackie Kay did move south when she was quite young. She moved from Scotland to England. She'd been given a standard Scottish upbringing, as I said. And this is about her losing those old terms that she used to use, you know, this is about changing language. So even though it's based on experience, it's not a memory of childhood, really. It's you know, the way it's described is quite fantastic, isn't it? You know, these words going off and wandering off on their own. It's highly imaginative. The words here are personified throughout. Our old words, they take on a life of their own, they abandon people, they wander, they bury themselves, yeah? So that kind of aspect. And also it's self-reflexive. It's a poem that is really aware about language and voice. It's talking about language and voice. It's using poetry to talk about that. It's reflecting on language and identity, it's voice and accent. So that really, you know, what you've got here is the phrase, my own vowels started to stretch like my bones. This is her way of referring to the English accent and the difference between Scots pronunciation and English pronunciation. Because in the English you've got these long vowels, yeah? So as she matures, as she grows, her voice is also taking on these long vowels. Changing pronunciation. So in Scotland, little cake thing is called a scone, yeah? In England, you might call it a scone. Yeah. So it's difference in pronunciation. Again, vowel sounds are different. She cries one day with the wrong sound in her mouth, you know. It's not the cries that she would give as a younger child. In Scotland, our accents changed to that. And even changing lexicon. So an ice cream cone, you know, a cornet in Scotland, or parts of Scotland, used to be called a pokey hat, because it looks like one of those little pokey hats. Although, best not put it in your head. So the loss of those terms that she's fond of. And the words itself, they're random, you know. All these phrases that she likes are really random Glasgow terms. They're quite specific to her childhood, you know, a specific time and place. So I put a bit of gloss there. You don't have to reach for a dictionary. Egypt is just idiot. Okay. What else we got? Dreich means gloomy. So the weather in Scotland is often dreich because it rains a lot. You know, so that's dreich weather or gloomy. What else we got? Wabbit is tired. I've never used that one in my life actually. I have to look that up. So you know, shows you regional variations. Crabbit is cranky or you know just kind of bad-tempered. If you're feeling a bit crabbit, you're just being a bit cranky. And other ones, to stummer is to stumble. A tutor is a Scots word, a lowland Scots word for a Highlander. Somebody from the Highlands is a tutor, tutor. It's meant to sound like their music. Sorry, Highlanders. And a headbanger is basically a headbanger. That's somebody who's been a bit crazy. You're banging your head, you know. So that's ideal. The next ones are Glasgow idiomatic phrases. It's just the kind of part phrases people add to the end of this conversation, you know. So instead of saying, my mum does this, you might start saying, see mama, she does this, you know. So it's just a kind of idiomatic phrase that you find in parts of Scotland. And the last one, shut your geggy or I'll give you the malky, is shut your mouth or I'll headbutt you. You know, which again is sort of like ordinary working class language. And the dur is what, sorry, sour is just pronunciation of sour. And to get loudy is to do something with energy, with gusto. Yeah. So again, that's principle. This reflects on the relationship between Scots and English. So I thought a good example, yeah, where she throws in some Scots terms here that she's fond of. She has a nostalgic attachment to within a largely English poem, and then talks about the differences in language and pronunciation. I've given you some other examples here to look at. Let's see if we can get it. You know, which are divorce and in my country. Please do look at them in your own time. Okay. They are not they're only part of a much larger corpus of works by Jackie Kay. So, you know, look at the Scottish Poetry website. Look more widely. Okay. And I think, oh sorry, I was going to finish this one. This is my last one. This is my last one. I just like this one. So Scotland got its parliament in 1999. It got its Mackers soon afterwards. Mackers are national poets in Scotland. One of their duties has been to open and sort of like do an address for the annual opening of Parliament. Jackie Kay's address in 2016 I thought was really quite good, given all that's going on in the world. This is it's a much longer poem. Okay, I've only given you a couple of excerpts. It's a really long poem, too long for us to do today, but I just like the excerpts because what she presents here is a very different version of Scotland from the one we saw in Robert Burns, the kind of romantic version of the Highlands, etc. Yeah, what we've got is a modern Britain that's been envisioned as positively as a place that she hopes is multicultural and also multilingual. Yeah, it's a place that welcomes people. So this is what she does, reading out in Parliament to all the MS members of Scottish Parliament there. This is what she reads out. Find here what you're looking for, democracy in its infancy. Guard her like you would a small daughter. Quite resonant for you today, of course. Keep the door wide open, not just ajar. And say in any language you please, welcome, welcome to the world's refugees. And then at the end of the poem, this is just an excerpt from it, she basically does all these messages of welcome in world languages. So it starts up there at the top. English, our strength is our difference. Dinna fear it, dinna call canny, that's Scots. Don't fear it, don't be cautious. Don't call canny means don't be cautious, yeah? And then she does other things. Other people who have made Scotland, or communities have made Scotland their home, yeah? Cantonese, Polish, Punjabi, French, got a bit Gaelic in there as well. Doric is a variant of Scotland, talk spoken in the northeast. And then, you know, Syrian, and even a wee bit of German. And I think that's the place to stop. Okay. Thank you.